Hey, Jordan from Pre-Condo here. So the title is a little bit of hyperbole, a little bit of clickbait, if you will. Don't hate me. A more apt title might be something like everyone in the Canadian government already knows what the problems are with the Canadian housing market, but nobody's putting forward an actionable plan to execute on. But that doesn't sound nearly as cool. So let's jump right into this. So first things first, let's start off with Trudeau's Promise for affordable housing for Canadians, a promise made in September of 2015. At the time of making this promise, the HPI benchmark price, so essentially your average Canadian house across the country, averaged in at $446,000. Today, the HPI benchmark is $839,000. So it's safe to say that the plan, or the lack of any actionable plan, isn't working. Now, it's also worth mentioning that many other countries are battling their own asset bubbles. Canada isn't alone as a result of COVID stimulus. But you can see here on this chart that Canada has outperformed all of the other G7 countries, not just prior to COVID, but during COVID as well. And a disclaimer here, guys, I have a huge conflict of interest in this particular topic. I sell hundreds of pre-condos every year in the GTA, and so I'll be the first to admit that I benefit greatly from the housing market. But with that being said, I do not think 10, 12, 20, 30% appreciation years are sustainable or healthy for the long-term market in Canada, nor are they good for Canadians as a whole. So let's dive deeper. Now, I realize some of my realtor colleagues may be quick to defend the housing price appreciation in Canada, saying things like, compared to New York City or Hong Kong, we are still relatively cheap. And while it's kind of true that on a world scale, we are relatively affordable, there's a systemic issue with your housing market when over 30% of first-time home buyers are receiving an average down payment gift of $82,000. And those numbers are a lot higher in Toronto and Vancouver. So that's just the average across Canada. And you can see further signs of dysfunction when you look at how many people are employed in the real estate industry. For example, there are over 60,000 realtors in Toronto alone on the Toronto Real Estate Board, which represents a rate of one realtor per 100 residences, which is a crazy stat in and of itself, because in New York City, there's roughly the same total amount of realtors, but double the population. Another interesting point that my friend Dan Foch pointed out here is that 35% of licensed agents do 0 deals per year, and roughly 50% of licensed agents do 1 deal or less per year. This raises the question about the barrier to entry in real estate and the ability to handle someone's, the largest financial transaction they'll make in their life, likely, with very limited education. And it also makes me wonder about the quality of the service and guidance that's being provided to clients from people who are doing 1 or 2 deals per year, because how experienced can you really be if you're only transacting at that level? Now, look, this isn't a slam against Trudeau in particular, and it's not an endorsement for any particular party's housing plan. He is on record recently acknowledging in an interview that the fundamental issue in the housing market in Canada is a supply and demand mismatch. Naturally, I'm not naive enough to believe that the government and all of their experts don't know that supply is an issue in Canada. The concern is that there is no concrete plan to change that. So CMHC recently put out a report that we're on track to hit 19 million homes across Canada by 2030 based on our current building proposals and projections. But they estimate that we need 22 million homes in order to address affordability, so a shortfall of 3 million homes. And in order to achieve Ontario's goal of building an additional 1.5 million homes over the next decade, we would need to increase our current housing completions by 11% per year every year. And you can see on this graph that it would go way beyond historical norms. The government has stated that this is their goal, but we haven't seen any plan of substance that addresses zoning or margin challenges to make this possible. So while the chart looks great, it is in its current state without a plan to go along with it, not based in reality. Now, I used to use this chart here to describe the different driving factors in the Canadian housing market, but I've realized we can distill this much further and make it simpler. In effect, it all boils down to supply and demand. Now, supply is pretty self-explanatory, right? It's how many new homes you have coming to market or completing. And demand can be measured in 2 ways, and they both affect the market. First, people, right? So essentially your net population gain versus your housing completions. Secondly, dollars available to those people. So debt instruments like mortgages, HELOCs, etc., and the interest rate or the cost of capital attached to those mortgages, which of course in turn affects affordability. So let's address supply first, because it's what I know best, and boy, do we have a lot to talk about. We're going to narrow into the GTA market here because it's what I have most data on. So here we have a tweet from Jagmeet talking about big developers driving up housing prices. Now, this isn't a unique take by any means to Jagmeet. This is a sentiment I hear often from frustrated first-time homebuyers and the average person who's not immersed in the real estate world. So let's talk about those greedy developers. Before we get started, comment below which section of this pie chart you think is the developer's profit margin. This is data I pulled from Build GTA, and it's the cost to build a 750 square foot condo in Toronto, including the developer's profit margin. And I broke it down into three main components. First being essentially the actual cost to build. So your land cost, your hard cost, your soft cost, materials, labor, marketing, sales. The second is the developer profit margin, of course. And the third is municipal, provincial, and federal government taxes, fees, development charges, that kind of thing. And there you have it. The developer profit margin is the smallest portion by quite a notable amount. The real takeaway here is that over 22% of the cost of a new condo is government-related fees. Tax, development charges, parkland levies, and soon we're adding inclusionary zoning, which is another big one. It is no secret that COVID has made construction more expensive. In fact, COVID has kind of made all of life more expensive, but I digress. The past couple of years here have costs of high-rise construction up nearly 30%, and the cost of low-rise construction is up even more than that. Now, some of those costs, in particular the material costs, will settle and start to come back down. But one cost that probably won't unless we enter a long recession is the cost of labor. This is a tweet from a colleague, Jeremiah, who does a lot of land deals in Toronto. Essentially, it's projected that 23% of the construction labor force is within 5 years of retirement, and we're only expecting 6% of new labor to come online, which raises the question, do we even have the capacity to build more? Now, the unfortunate side effect of rapidly inflating cost to build is twofold. One, you see many developers hold off on launching until sentiment and conditions improve. And two, you unfortunately see condo projects that have already launched canceling as a result of margin disappearing. And when margin disappears, they may not be able to get their construction financing. Now, the good news is that buyers of those condo projects will, of course, get their deposits back. But the bad news is, this is just the harsh reality of margins in Toronto. They're quite low. I'm close with a number of developers and they all tell me the same thing. They make the exact same margin selling today at $1,500 a square foot as they did back in the day selling at $750 a square foot. This chart from Urban Nation illustrates what I mean by developers launching less new product to market. You can see that as a result of COVID and the uncertainty in the condo market at the time, developers just held off and launched less units than what was projected, which means fewer new homes coming online down the market. When times are uncertain or margins are tough to meet, they just sit on land and they don't launch projects until things improve. And if you thought development profitability was already looking rough, well, it's getting worse. The city of Toronto is proposing a 49% increase in development charges. So for example, the developers used to have to pay about $55,000 for a 2-bed unit. This proposal brings that up to over $80,000. And if you're not familiar, development charges are essentially to support the increased density as an area gentrifies. So for example, sidewalks, public schools, local public amenities, all of these things need to get built to support the community. And I'm all for that. Development charges absolutely need to happen. However, you do have to contextualize the amount the city is asking for. So for example, based on this Build report, if you look at government fees as a percentage of new home prices in the US, you'll notice that San Francisco is 9% and Miami is 13%. That same number in Toronto is north of 20%. CMHC's recent report here further contextualized this, and they said that the development charges for low rise in the GTA is on average 3 times higher than comparable markets in the US, and high rise development charges are roughly 50% higher than the US. And I should also point out here that the city is currently sitting on $2.6 billion in development charges in reserve, and Ontario municipalities as a collective whole are sitting on $5 billion in reserve. So the takeaway from development charges is that the government tells us they want more affordable housing, they want more housing built, while simultaneously making it harder to build. You can see the effects of this addiction to taxing new housing supply in real time with the average price per square foot of a new condo launch in Toronto over the past few years. The reason that new condos now cost 20% more than existing condos is not that the developers are gouging you. Just 5-10 years ago, the premium for pre-construction was only 5 to 10% above the resale market. They cost that much because the developments have to be economically feasible to get built at all. So we have construction costs going up and we have development charges going up. And now we also have the recent addition of inclusionary zoning, which is a great marketing term because it sounds like the opposite of exclusionary zoning. But basically, as of next year, any new condo development zoned over 100 units in Toronto will have to make 5 to 10% of the units that they would normally otherwise sell affordable rental units. Now, this sounds great on paper because we do need more affordable housing in Toronto. In fact, we have a 7-year wait list for affordable rentals in the city, but developers aren't being offered incentives or other fees in order to make up the difference on their margin. So inclusionary zoning in effect increases the price of new condos for 99% of people in order to provide affordable housing to the 1% who do need it most. I definitely agree that we need more affordable units, but further taxing new housing supply in an effort to create affordable housing is, of course, a backwards policy. This cost study here shows that a developer would need to increase their selling prices by $91 per square foot, or about $68,000 for a 750 square foot unit, in order to meet their profit targets with inclusionary zoning versus without. Now, to me, the bigger issue than the increase in cost is going to be the decrease in new housing supply. So Portland also tried inclusionary zoning on condos without incentives or development charge breaks for developers. And the result that you can see from this graph is that new development applications fell off a cliff as developers could no longer make the numbers work. A strategy that would probably make a lot more sense would be to give developers incentives or breaks on development charges in favor of inclusionary zoning. That way we get both the affordable units, but also we don't see supply constriction on the new housing market. And while we're on the topic of government regulation in the housing market, it's probably worth looking to a past example of unintended consequences. You might remember Kathleen Wynne's Fair Housing Plan in 2017. This was born out of good intentions to help renters and home buyers. The headline, the big ticket items were 15% non-resident speculation tax and rental control on all units occupied after 1991. You can see here on this graph what happened to rental prices shortly after implementing this plan. Scotiabank also put out a report estimating the Canadian housing shortfall back in 2021. And one of the big takeaways that you can see here is that we have the lowest housing supply per capita in the G7. Yet somehow the Canadian government is shocked that housing prices in Canada are appreciating faster than the other G7 countries. Particularly frustrating here is that the development approval process in the GTA is completely broken. In Canada as a whole, I'd go so far to say. In terms of the length of time it takes to get a project approved, Canada ranks 34th slowest out of 35 OECD countries. And in Toronto specifically, we love to designate old, dilapidated dry cleaners as heritage sites to prevent new housing being built and to preserve community character. And that's a true story. It probably doesn't help either that 70% of land zoned in Toronto is restricted to single detached or semi-detached homes. If you look to other noteworthy cities around the world, you see a lot more mid-rise along central arterial roads, which allows for more housing supply to come on market. And you can see in this 3D model of Toronto, all of those low-rise homes that are currently not eligible to be converted into multi-unit properties. All right, so we have beat the supply side of the equation to death. So now let's talk about population growth, the demand side of the equation. You can see here from the Scotia report from earlier that the number of housing units per capita is actually decreasing across Canada from an average of 427 units per thousand people in 2016 to 424 units per thousand in 2020, which effectively means we're not building enough supply to keep up with the population growth. And if we take 2006 to 2018 and compare housing completions versus immigration in the US and Canada, this is what we get. The US averaged roughly 1.175 million new immigrants yearly and completed roughly the same amount of housing per year. In Canada, we immigrated 287,000 on average and only completed 187,000 new homes. Now we can get more granular on this data if we zoom into the GTA for 2018 and 2019. This is a quick chart I made with the data from CMHC on housing completions and StatsCan on immigration. During the 2-year period, we saw a net population growth from immigration of 252,000 people. During the same period of time, we only completed enough new housing to adequately house a population increase of 155,000. So we were short about 38,000 dwellings. And looking at Ontario's population projection into 2046, it becomes clear that we're going to see a higher rate of population growth into the future. And this chart was released before the updated federal government immigration targets. So you can consider this chart a conservative estimate. So these are the new targets here. Now, does this all mean we should slow immigration? No. It just means we should build more housing. If anything, we should be targeting in our economic class of immigrants, we should be targeting skilled trades workers because we know that many are retiring and we need more capacity to build more homes. And finally, we get to the dollar side of the demand equation. Housing demand is also massively affected by the availability of credit and the interest rate attached to that. At the time of making this video, we're partway through a rate hiking cycle and you can see housing prices correcting in real time. The areas so far that have been most sensitive to those rate hikes are the ones that appreciated the most through COVID. Areas like Durham, York, and Peel are already down 10 to 20% off their February peak highs. But it's worth noting many of these areas appreciated, 50 to 80% through COVID. So naturally, they're of course the most rate sensitive. Remember when the Bank of Canada said that rates would stay low for a very long time? And one thing I do want to point out here, guys, is that if prices fall 15%, but your interest rate doubles, affordability may not actually improve because your payments go up roughly to the same amount they would be if you had a lower rate and a higher price. So unless you're buying cash, if prices fall 15%, but mortgage rates double, affordability doesn't really improve for the average Canadian, sort of the marginal buyer who's using leverage to purchase a home. So here's a chart of the average selling price of a detached home in Toronto, and I've pointed out a couple key moments in time. The first being the original mortgage stress test, which reduced the size of the mortgage you could qualify for. And you can see that it played out by kind of causing housing prices to trade sideways as it was implemented and took effect. And for comparison, here's Durham region. So I just kind of picked a suburb at random. So Durham is an interesting case study to me because when COVID hit, two things happened. Rates cut, which increased the dollar side of demand, and people left the cities and fled to suburbs looking for more space as work from home took effect. And you can see that side, so the people side of the equation, changed as well. And you can see the effect it had on prices in Durham. They absolutely ran. And of course, now you can see that through the rate hikes, they are falling, currently back to their October of last year pricing. Finally, here we have Toronto condos, my personal favorite. You can see here that the original stress test positively impacted prices on Toronto condos. And I see really two reasons for that. One, Toronto condo appreciation had lagged detached appreciation for a number of years leading up to the stress test. And so relatively, by comparison, they looked like a very good deal. And number two, the mortgage stress test, of course, affected your buying power and reduced what you could qualify for. So you have a really good deal in Toronto condos, and now you maybe can no longer qualify for that townhome or detached in the suburbs. Suddenly, Toronto condos seem like a very good purchase. In a way, being bullish on housing in Canada outperforming other asset classes is betting on government incompetence. And betting on government incompetence, in my view, is a lot like betting on April snowfall in Toronto. It shouldn't happen. You hate to see it, but one day every year, like clockwork, you regret pulling those snow tires off a few weeks early. And before I get roasted in the comments, guys, this is not a slam against any particular party. I understand that there's a disconnect with incentives and that municipalities truly hold the keys to the kingdom when it comes to zoning and approvals. But these are issues that need to be addressed at all levels of government with some level of cohesion in order for us to have any chance at hitting our building targets. Now, do I think that will happen? No. And that's why I remain bullish on the long-term outlook of Canadian housing. I'll leave you guys with that. If you like this type of content, please like and subscribe the video, and I would love to hear your comments in the comment section below. And if you're looking to get into real estate, you want to talk pre-construction, real estate investing in general, I'd love to chat. The link to call me is in the description. Take care, and I will see you guys next video.